has it been warmer than this before? One has heard in history of a medieval warm period when you could grow wine grapes in Scotland. You certainly can't do that now. They used to grow in Yorkshire. My family had estates there at about that time. The Vikings were farming places in Greenland which are now under permafrost. If you go to their major settlement in Greenland at Valsay, the place where they buried their bodies is now under permafrost. It certainly wasn't under permafrost when they buried them. So we know, therefore, that in Greenland, in Europe, when the great cathedrals were built, in Britain, there was a medieval warm period. So now what we're going to do is look at what the UN's report in 1990 said about the medieval warm period. It produced this graph, which I have colorized so you can see it clearly. Here is a thing showing the medieval warm period, and it was labeled by the IPCC as medieval warm period. It's very plainly visible there. Here is the little ice age during the Maunder minimum, when there were no sunspots on the sun for about 60 years and the temperatures went down. And here is the current period. Eventually it's going to go up a bit, but it's still a long way below what was shown in the IPCC's 1990 graph. Now, just 11 years later, in 2001, this graph appeared. No medieval warm period. Just like that, as Tommy Cooper might say. It vanished, it disappeared. And so we get this, what they call the hockey stick graph. It runs along all the way like this, and then it goes up here, as though this is somehow exceptional. Now the UN, the IPCC, they were really pleased with this graph. They printed it 6 times, large and in full colour, in their 2001 report. The only graph to appear 6 times, the only graph to appear in full colour 6 times. The question then arises, how did they achieve this remarkable result in just 11 years to wipe out all the historical records, all the enormous number of papers in the scientific literature attesting in one way or another to the existence of a medieval warm period all around the world? How did they do it? Here's one of the things they did. They took a particular type of data, a particular data set, and here it is from Sheep Mountain, California, and this particular data set has a very satisfactory, from their point of view, hockey stick shape. Up it goes at the end there, the blade of the hockey stick and the shank along there. But this one from Mayberry Slough in Arizona doesn't have that. It has a sort of peak in 1800, but then otherwise it's more or less jogging along all in a straight line. So what did they do? They gave this data 390 times as much weighting in their computer program as they gave this data, because this data gave them the shape they wanted to have. It's an extraordinary thing. They then went on and left out the tree ring data set that included the medieval warm period, because if you put it back in, then it showed that the medieval warm period was actually there. They said they'd included the data set they'd left out. They published a paper in Nature, 1998, and again in 1999. They said they'd included that data set, but they hadn't. They'd actually left it out. They'd hidden the missing data in a file which was marked on their own computer, where it was later found by 2 diligent researchers from Canada. They'd hidden it in a file marked censored data. That's what they'd done with it, censored data. They inserted their own estimates in place of the censored data, but did not publish or tell anyone the fact that they had done so. If the omitted data were reinserted, bingo, the vanished medieval warm period reappeared. Here's where it comes. Suddenly the medieval warm period is back. Now the way the scientific method works is that if somebody puts forward a hypothesis that there was a hockey stick-shaped graph and there was no medieval warm period, they must make their data and their methods freely, fully, immediately and widely available, so that tiresome nuisances like me can check to see whether they did the sums right, which in this case, alas, they didn't. A report by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States also confirmed that the graph was defective, saying that its conclusions were no better than plausible at best, and that it had a validation skill not significantly different from 0. But none of this, however much we may attack this graph, none of this tells us whether there was a medieval warm period. So now we're going to look at a few slides that establish where it is in the literature. Now this is done by taking 6,000 borehole temperature readings from all over the world. Of course, this is not what the actual temperature was, but it gives you a rough idea that yes, there was a medieval warm period, and yes, there was a little ice age. And then we move on to an isotope study of a stalagmite from Spannagel Cave in the Austrian Alps. Another stalagmite, Cold Air Cave, Makabanskat Valley in South Africa. Lots of these papers are showing the medieval warm period. But when I first wrote on this, I was accused by various sort of militant websites on this subject of cherry picking. So let's just see a few more, shall we? Just so that you can see I'm not cherry picking. Let's go to the Li Chao Peninsula from South China. Let's go to the northwestern Arabian Sea. Let's go to the Sargasso Sea, to New Zealand, to the North Island of New Zealand, to the Spanish Pyrenees, to northern Fennoscandia, to the Swiss Alps, 3 of them there, to Canada. Let's go to British Columbia. Let's go to the Azores. Let's go to coastal Peru. Let's go to coastal Peru again, just for fun. Let's go all the way to the summit of the Greenland ice sheet, and there it is again. Let's go to a timescale sensitive reconstruction of northern hemisphere temperatures. There's your hot spot for the medieval warm period. There's your cold spot for the little ice age. They're clearly shown on that graph too. Here is the reconstruction of a particular tree line from a particular species of tree, Zelkova carpinifolia, which shows the medieval warm period. Here, this is the line roughly corresponding to today's tree line. There it is, medieval warm period. Here is the Roman warm period, and here is the Holocene climate optimum, where for a period of around 1,000 years or more, the temperature was quite noticeably higher because the tree line was higher. And why is it called an optimum? Because actually, warmer is better. Why we're gloomy about this is it's quite extraordinary. It's better to have a warmer climate. Why do most species in the world live in the tropics? Because it's warmer there. Why do practically no species live in the Arctic and the Antarctic? Because it freezes your nuts off and it makes reproduction difficult. And then let's just look at something from the real world. These graphs are all very well, but here is a tree stump. See how isolated it is. It's dated 1340 AD by carbon dating, and that's at the height of the medieval warm period. It stands in splendid isolation well above today's California tree line. And because it did exist, because there was a medieval warm period, and it was in some places 3 3/4 degrees Celsius higher the temperature than it is today, we cannot safely say that today's temperatures are exceptional. We can say, because everybody agrees this, that it was nature that caused the medieval climate warming. There's virtually nobody who would try to maintain that we were having enough of an influence on climate then to cause that warming. There was no medieval climate cataclysm. That's why we call it the medieval climate optimum, because it was rather nice and big cathedrals were built all over Europe. Civilization sprung up in places it couldn't have sprung up in before. Nature, therefore, it is a possibility, we can't draw this conclusion for definite, but nature may be causing most warming today. And finally, climate catastrophe, therefore, may not be either looming or likely. These are the conclusions we can respectively draw.